Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Ossining Public Library. I'm Diana Lennon, Head of Adult Services, and I am very glad we're gathering tonight on the anniversary of Kristallnacht with Agnes Schipper, author of Sabine's Odyssey. We will have time after Agnes's presentation for some discussion and questions, so just please save your questions. And before I introduce Agnes, I would like to read two sentences from the introduction to her book, which I think will resonate with you as they did with me. Sabine's story has relevance today given resurgent anti-Semitism, the rise of autocrats who stir fear and hatred, and the scapegoating of refugees and immigrants. My hope as the daughter of a hidden child is that Sabine's story not only will inspire readers to speak out against anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination when they encounter such, but also that they will feel more compassion towards refugees. I think that says it perfectly, Agnes, and I appreciate those words. Let me tell you a little bit about Agnes. She is the daughter of a hidden child and member of the Dutch resistance who helped save her mother from the Holocaust. Born in New York City and raised in Westchester, as a Catholic, Agnes did not learn about her mother's hidden Jewish ancestry until she was 20. Her book chronicles the experiences of her mother's family before and after Kristallnacht, including harrowing years spent in hiding, experiences her mother did not disclose to her children for decades. Welcome, Agnes.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you very much for joining on this presentation. Tonight is the 84th anniversary of Kristallnacht, which happened the night of November 9th to 10th in 1938. Kristallnacht was a watershed event for Germany and for my mother's family. It was the demarcation point. There was life before and life after Kristallnacht. For my mother's family, it meant a complete unraveling from a comfortable upper middle class life to being forced into refugee status, leaving home, school, career, and nearly all possessions behind in what would become a struggle for survival. The family records on my mother's side go back to the 1700s in Prussia, even before the unification of the German states. And you can see from this list that her ancestors were productive members of German society. Perhaps the most famous one is Ferdinand Kohn, the first to classify bacteria. During the mid-1800s, Jews rapidly ascended into the professions as restrictions were lifted. And some actually sought to assimilate by changing their name and converting to Christianity. But I'm going to fast forward and start the story here. This is the surgical clinic and hospital built by my great-grandfather, Dr. Franz Nissen. He built his own hospital around 1910 in Nysa, which is in southwest Germany near the Czech border. The Nissen family lived on the first floor, and the surgical suites, patient rooms, and staff for quarters were on the upper floor. Margareta, my great-grandmother, and his wife, helped him run the hospital. So the three Nissen grandchildren, including my grandmother and two great-uncles, literally grew up in a hospital. This is a photograph of Dr. Franz. He's the one sitting with his arms folded just to the right of the poor gentleman with his leg in a cast and elevated. This is another shot of him sitting on the balcony of the Nissen Clinic reading. At the start of World War I, the German military assigned Dr. Nissen to run a military hospital for severely wounded soldiers. Meanwhile, his son, Rudy, then in medical school, was drafted in service as a medic. The Nissen Clinic still stands today. It is now used as a bank, and it's in Nysa, Poland, because this portion of Germany was partitioned off to Poland after World War II. The Nissen Surgical Clinic is where the next character enters the story. This is Georg, which is German for George, Fröhlich, a young lawyer called to active duty by the German military at the beginning of World War I. He was charged with the administration of military hospitals. In 1915, he goes to the Nissen Clinic to meet with Dr. Nissen. During the meeting, Dr. Franz's daughter Edith walks in. She's a teacher on a visit to her parents. She was a stunningly beautiful young woman, as I believe these photographs attest. Dr. Franz introduced her to George, who looks up, nods, and immediately returns back to his discussion with Dr. Franz. This was very unusual for Edith. She was quite the beauty of her day, and she was used to having young eligible men pay attention to her, flatter and fawn over her. So George stood out in that respect. Despite his seeming indifference, he did indeed take notice and began courting her. They married in 1918 after the military discharged George shortly before the end of World War I. The German military awarded both Dr. Franz and George Iron Crosses in honor of their military service. This is a photo of Edith and George together, taken about 10 years after their marriage. They settled in Breslau, then the ninth largest German city in southwestern Germany. George began a very successful law practice, a corporate law practice, and was a board member of several corporations. He had his own law firm and several junior lawyers working for him. The Fröhlichs became essentially wealthy upper middle class. They vacationed in the Austrian Alps and along the Riviera and the Baltic Sea. George was an avid mountain climber. And when they would go on vacation, he would have his secretary take the train with him for the first few stops on the way to the vacation destination so he could continue dictating memos to her. He was what we would call today a workaholic. Andreas Fröhlich was born on October 14th, 1921. I think Edith looks radiantly happy. These photographs of Andreas and his mom capture this kind of sweet and shy nature of Andreas. He began school very young and did not earn good grades. My grandfather was very harsh with him about that, but would not allow Andreas to be held back from school because he thought that would be an embarrassment for the family. Andreas might have had dyslexia before that became a diagnosis. He developed a stutter that eased in later years. This is a photograph of Andreas with his grandparents, Dr. Franz, Margareta, and then his mother in the background, again taken on the balcony of the Nissen Clinic in Nysa. My mother, Sabine, was born on January 7th, 1927, when Edith actually introduced Andreas to his sister. He didn't believe she was a girl. Sie hat aber einen Bubikopf, but she has a boy's head, he protested. By all accounts, Sabine had a happy, idyllic childhood. She went to private schools, had music and dance lessons, and vacationed with her family in the Alps and on the Baltic Sea. The Fröhlichs had 11 servants, including a housekeeper, Frau Emma, who was like a second mother to Sabine. There's a particularly well-documented vacation in Zupote, the Baltic seaside town. When my mother was around 2, I suspect there was an itinerant photographer roaming around taking some of these pictures. I'm particularly fond of this picture from that series because it shows Andreas leaning over and whispering to Sabine. To me, it personifies sibling affection, that kind of close and indelible bond that siblings can have, especially when there are only 2 in the family. And another classic beach shot from that same series. Although born a little over 5 years apart, Andreas and Sabine were very close. Sabine described Andreas as a wonderful, protective, a big brother, very protective of her. Even though Sabine looks very sweet in this picture, she was anything but. She was the opposite of her brother, talkative and temperamental. She was an excellent student who skipped grades. She was a tomboy and a bit of a hellion. She hated doing handiwork such as embroidery that was expected of young girls. So her brother would do it for her while she played soccer outside with the neighborhood kids. When she got into trouble, which was often, and was sent to her room, Andreas would come to her room to comfort her. Sabine hated wearing this particular hairdo. It was called Affenschachteln or monkey swings because of it was a popular hairstyle, but she hated all the fussing that went with it because you had to brush and comb and braid and then pin up and put bows in. She had absolutely no patience for that, and you can almost see the resentment of those hated braids in this picture. Edith Fröhlich was a very social woman who always dressed beautifully and fashionably. She became involved in local charities. If you look closely at the picture on the left, you will see that Edith is wearing a cross. She converted to Catholicism in the 1920s at the urging of her best friend and raised her children as Catholic. George did not practice any religion. This is a photograph of Sabine taken for her first Holy Communion. She was enrolled in a Catholic school run by nuns. I just wanted to double check. I have a little thing about the meeting being recorded. That's not interfering with the slides people are seeing, is it? Good. It's just on my screen. Okay. In 1933, Hitler rose to power. My mother had vivid memories of seeing Hitler when he visited Breslau, and particularly hearing him shouting back and forth with the adoring crowds. Hitler would scream, "Ein Volk," and the crowd would scream back, "Ein Volk," it's one people, and then "Ein Reich," one nation, "Ein Führer," one leader. She also remembers seeing the large red swastika flags draping many of the buildings when Hitler visited. George was a German patriot who thought Hitler was an extremist nut who would not rise to power. And when Hitler did, and the Nazis began enacting restrictions on Jews, my grandfather thought he would outlast the rogues. The picture on the right you can see in the bottom was taken in 1936. The anti-Semitism of the Nazis was based on racial theories, not religion. Anyone who had 3 or more Jewish grandparents was classified as a Jew regardless of religious practices. George's parents and grandparents, all long dead, were Jewish. Because George was classified as a Jew, he was forced to resign his corporate board memberships. He continued to practice law, but at a reduced scale, and had to have his non-Jewish junior attorney sign any papers filed with the court. Edith had Jewish parents, but non-practicing. Sabine, my mother's first inkling that she was somehow different from her Christian friends, came in the mid-1930s when her brother was not allowed to join the immensely popular Hitler Youth. He so much wanted to wear the uniform like so many of his friends, but because his grandparents were all Jewish, Andreas was classified as Jewish, and only Aryan children could become members of the Hitler Youth. So my grandmother arranged for him to join a religious-oriented scout troop that also had a uniform, and you can see him standing so proudly in this picture wearing his uniform. The Fröhlich parents shielded their children from the increasingly ugly politics percolating in Nazi Germany. The children continued to go to their Catholic schools and play with neighborhood friends. Andreas is shown here riding his bike around his Breslau neighborhood. While George and his family stayed in Germany, many friends and relatives began leaving Germany in the 1930s. Ferdinand Nissen, nicknamed Ferdi, he's the one to the right of Edith and to the left of George, was an economics professor. He is the sister of Edith, the brother of Edith, rather. He was an economics professor at Frankfurt University. He left Germany in 1933 after he was fired from his position because he was Jewish. He first went to Switzerland, then Turkey, but then was able to obtain US visas, and these photos were taken in 1938 when he was on his way to the United States. Edith's other brother, Rudolf Nissen, nicknamed Rudy, was a surgeon like his father. He was told he could stay on in the surgical hospital staff at Charité Hospital in Berlin, but he had to fire all the Jewish doctors working under him. He refused, resigned, and accepted a position in Turkey. Rudy later obtained a US visa and in 1939 moved with his family to Boston, where he had been offered a surgery fellowship. Going back, you can see by 1938 she had those hated braids cut off in this picture. Anyway, unlike the Nissen brothers, George did not have a portable profession that could be easily adapted and used in other countries. But then came Kristallnacht. When the Nazis rampaged nationwide, the pretext for a night of cataclysmic violence was the assassination of a German diplomat by a young Polish Jewish man. During that horrific night, the Nazis destroyed over 1,000 synagogues, some 7,500 Jewish businesses. They also arrested some 30,000 Jewish men simply for being Jewish, and sent them to concentration camps where most were mistreated but released after a few weeks if they signed their assets over to the Nazis. 91 Jews were killed during the night of violence. My grandfather's law offices were on the second floor, so they were not destroyed, but his optimism was shattered. Although an ardent German patriot and decorated war veteran, he finally accepted there was no future for his family in Germany. My mother termed Kristallnacht as his wake-up call. A few days later, Nazi edicts banned all Jewish children from attending public and non-Jewish private schools, so my mother at age 11 and her brother at age 17 were forced to leave their schools. The first thing the Freilichs did after Kristallnacht was to plan to evacuate their children, gathering the necessary paperwork, health records, and applying for passports. Andreas was the first one evacuated, a very religious young man. He hoped to become a priest. He was first sent to a monastery in Wals, Netherlands, which is on the border with Germany. The abbot there arranged for him to attend a pre-seminary school in England. Next to be evacuated was Sabine. Note the Nazi swastika and the big J for Jew on her passport. Notice also the name is Bella. The Nazis required all persons of Jewish ancestry to take on more, quote, Jewish names, such as Bella. So they robbed Sabine both of her schooling and her name. The British, along with German refugees, arranged to rescue some 10,000 children from Nazi-occupied countries and transport them to England. And this is my mother in front of her Breslau home, holding her little suitcases, leaving for the transport. This was January 1939, shortly after her 12th birthday. With her are Edith on the far left, her mother, and family servants, Frau Schwarze and Frau Emma. Sabine was placed with an American family in England and enrolled in an English school. While the children were safeguarded in England, the Freilich parents began dismantling their home and business over the next 6 months. They were forced to Aryanize their properties, that is, to transfer them at artificially low rates to Aryans, and then paid a huge tax called a Rechtfluchtsteuer tax, essentially a tax for the privilege of fleeing Germany. These are pictures of their living room in Breslau, which they called the Biedermeierzimmer because of all the Biedermeier-style furniture in it. If you look closely at the photograph sitting on top of the piano on the left, that is one of a series taken in 1938 before the evacuation. The Freilich parents applied for visas for their whole family, where they hoped to join Edith's 2 brothers who would vouch for them. They also prepaid boat fares to the United States. When the US visas did not come through, they went to Wals, Netherlands to await the visas. This is the 4-story townhome today. It is now in Wrocław, Poland, again, another piece of Germany that was partitioned off, and it's now been subdivided into 4 apartments. That's my sister and me. We visited there in 2016. In the summer of 1939, after the English school term ended, the Freilich parents had their children come to the Netherlands from England to join them to spend their vacation in Wals. This photograph was taken in Wals. There's Andreas on the left, Edith, Pater Adams, the head abbot of the monastery in Wals, who had arranged for Andreas to attend the pre-seminary school in England. But on September 1, 1939, World War II broke out when Germany invaded Poland. England, standing by its treaty with Poland, declared war. The Freilichs decided not to send the children back to England. They reasoned that Holland was safer because it was neutral during World War I. Holland and Netherlands are used interchangeably. And they believed that Hitler would not dare invade a neutral country. They were also concerned that they could be interned in England as enemy aliens, as happened to many German refugees there. So they decided to move the whole family to Pension Oliva. A pension is like a small hotel or boarding house, and it was run by a niece of George. They enrolled their children in private schools. This is how the pension looks today, 2 buildings and now private residences. This is a photo taken in 1940 in the backyard of Pension Oliva in Amsterdam. And they look pretty happy dancing together in the back courtyard. On May 10th, 1940, however, the Germans did indeed invade neutral the Netherlands. The Dutch surrendered in 5 days after the Luftwaffe obliterated Rotterdam. The Fröhlichs became trapped. I put this map up here so you can see the small country of Netherlands in kind of the upper right-hand corner. And you can see that it is surrounded by Nazi Germany, occupied Belgium, and then to the west by the North Sea and English Channel that was patrolled by U-boats. So escape was very difficult once the invasion happened. After the invasion, all residents were required to register and carry identity cards. If you were Jewish, by the Nazis' definition, you had to register with the Jewish Council set up by the Nazis. This is my mother's original Dutch ID card. Notice the big J for Jew, and also the red stripe going across. That identifies her as a buitenlander, a foreigner. That J on the card marked you first for segregation, then isolation, and later deportation, and ultimately annihilation. In short, J spelled doom for most Jews who carried this identity card. This is the yellow star. Joods is Jew in Dutch, that those of Jewish ancestries were forced to wear. A Nazi edict once again banned Sabine from attending her Catholic school, this time at age 14. Restrictions methodically tightened against Jews. They were excluded from public venues, theaters, libraries, swimming pools, most stores, and even trams. This is the last photo taken of Andreas in late May 1941, when he was 19 years old. I believe it was taken for a hoped-for visa. My father, through connections with family friends, was working to obtain a visa to Ecuador, having given up on the US visas coming through. On June 11th, 1941, Sabine was home alone in her parents' room at the pension after school when 2 plainclothesmen came there and knocked on the door. They asked for Andreas by name. They looked about her brother's age. Sabine thought they were fellow acolytes from a religious group her brother belonged to. She innocently assisted the young men in locating her brother in a room in the pension building next door. She realized too late that the young men were actually Dutch police sent by the Gestapo to round up young Jewish men as hostages in retaliation for a Dutch act of sabotage. No one had warned her about the roundups in progress. 4 months later, Andreas perished in the Mauthausen concentration camp, a brutal place located in a quarry in Austria, where captives were worked to death, thrown to their death, executed, starved, or later gassed. Of the 900 young men of Jewish ancestry rounded up in the Netherlands and sent to that camp in 1941, only 8 were alive by the end of the year. So how did my mother and her parents survive when 3/4 of all Jews living there in pre-war Netherlands were deported and killed? Friends of the family, including friends of Andreas, would help them survive the German occupation by creating false identification cards, finding hiding places, and securing rations for food. This is the last of the false identification cards that was created for my mother. She lived under a series of assumed names during her 3 years in hiding. Note the big J is gone, as is the red stripe across the center of the identity card. She is now Sophie Fossen, born in Vaals, Netherlands. For each false identity card created, she had to memorize an entire history created for that ID. My mother was hidden in 9 different places. Her parents hid separately from her for most of the war in 5 different places. And next, I'm going to show you pictures of some of the rescuers. Han Asperg, shown here, was the father of a school friend of Sabine. He owned a company that printed Catholic liturgical texts. He used his printing press to create and forge papers for Sabine and her parents. In 1942, he found the first hiding place for my mother in a convent under the assumed name of Liesje Schmidt, born in Indonesia. While Sabine was in the convent, a German policeman came to pick up Edith for deportation. On the tram to the deportation center, Edith faked a heart attack. The policeman brought her to a clinic where the doctor told him, "This woman is dying." The policeman left. She made her way back to the pension, then left with George to stay with friends. The people taken in that mass roundup were deported to Auschwitz, where most were gassed shortly on arrival. Sabine left the convent after 4 months and had to resurface with her original ID card with the big J because her father thought he finally would get the transit visa via Spain to go to Ecuador, but it all fell apart. He did not get the visas. My mother described those months back in Amsterdam in 1942, early 1943, as the worst time of the war, a time of constant terror because of all the mass roundups and deportations. These are photographs of Agnes Nolte, my mother's favorite teacher. Agnes Nolte hid Sabine in the attic of her Amsterdam apartment for 3 months. Anyone caught hiding Jews was subject to arrest and deportation to a concentration camp. Amsterdam became a very dangerous place to hide, as was the experience of Anne Frank and her family. Friends of Andreas who had joined the resistance made the first contacts with the resistance cells in North Holland, in the North Holland countryside, to find safer hiding locations. The Fröhlichs had to be moved multiple times for their safety. After the Fröhlich parents left Amsterdam, the German police came to the Pension Oliva to arrest George. The experiences of the Fröhlichs in the hiding places were mixed. Some hosts were kind, others were exploitative, using Sabine for hard labor. There's no time today to go into all those experiences in this talk, so I'm going to skip ahead to her 6th hiding place. It is now the spring of 1944. She is working for the family as a nanny for the family of a doctor and living under the false name of Sophie Fredericks, nicknamed Fietje. One day, a tall, blonde Dutchman wearing a trench coat and a felt hat knocks on the door. He does not identify himself. He just asks to see the identity card for Fietje. The doctor's wife tells the man he will have to wait until the doctor comes home. She then tells Sabine, "I'm afraid they have found you," and instructs her to wait in the room next door. Sabine is terrified, sure the young man has come to arrest her, that her parents had already been arrested and the doctor would be arrested next for hiding her. Remember that 3 years earlier, plainclothes policemen had come to arrest her brother in Amsterdam. A short time later, the doctor walks in and greets the man by name. "Hello, Mr. Schipper." Mr. Schipper, Cornelius Nicholas Schipper, was a member of the Dutch resistance sent by his uncle, a resistance leader, to check on the numbers of Sabine's false ID card to obtain more rations for her. And that is how my parents met. The young man in the Dutch military uniform is my dad. His nickname was Cor. He did participate in the brief defense against the German invasion. He worked in his father's business, growing and exporting flower bulbs. During the war, they had to switch to growing food such as cauliflower, potatoes, and other edibles. This is another photograph of him in his uniform. And these are childhood photographs taken in front of my father's home. He's with his parents, Maria Elizabeth and Klaas Bersman on the far right, and his 3 sisters. And this is an interior shot with a Cor on the left. I'm going to spend some time on this particular photograph. It was taken in May 1939 for the 25th wedding anniversary of my grandparents, Klaas and Maria Elisabeth Schipper. My grandfather Klaas came from a large, tight-knit family of mostly farmers. The picture was taken in front of their Hochkarspel home, and those are the 12 Schipper siblings lined up. My grandfather is standing in the middle, the third from the left. Oops, sorry. Next to him is his brother Jan, whose farm becomes headquarters for a resistance cell and a transit station for some 200 hidden persons. Hidden persons, by the way, were not just Jews, but also young Dutchmen evading slave labor in Germany. Jan's sons, my father's cousins, took people from Jan's farm to longer-term hiding places in the countryside. Next to Jan is Cor Schipper, my father's namesake uncle. I apologize, I'm going to turn this off. We're left off with Jan. Am I right? So next to Jan is Cornelis, my father's namesake uncle Schipper, who recruited him to the resistance and was a resistance leader. On the far left is Kees Schipper, whose farm is next to Jan Schipper's farm. He had 2 Jewish children. Sitting in the middle on the front is Tante G. Tante is aunt. She had a Jewish family of 4 parents and 2 sons in her attic. The Schippers are all Catholics. You are looking at what is described as righteous Gentiles, a term for non-Jews who did the right thing during World War II and helped save Jews from annihilation. Most Dutch people were bystanders. The Schippers were what is now termed as upstanders. A few months after my parents met, Uncle Cor is arrested by the Dutch Nazis. He is imprisoned, sent to Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp near Berlin, where he perishes in September of 1944. When Uncle Cor was arrested, everyone understood he could be tortured and forced to reveal the names of resistance members and the hidden persons. My father had to take over some 35 families under his uncle's protection and move them to new hiding places, and that would include the Fröhlich parents in Sabine. The local parish priest helped him find new homes for the hidden persons. Although tortured, Uncle Cor never gave up any names. There's not enough time to detail all my father's other resistance work, which included guiding Allied pilots who dropped canisters of weapon at night in North Holland for the resistance. Because my father had learned English for the bulb export trade, he was assigned to communicate with Canadian and British pilots during those weapon drops. In this post-war photo, he is demonstrating how he used an S-phone, kind of like a walkie-talkie, to communicate with the Allied pilots. The picture was published in a Dutch paper post-war. These are the last of the rescuers, Jan and Johanna Elders. He was the mayor of a small town in North Holland, in Bovenkarspel, another North Holland town, who hid the Fröhlich parents. My mother spent the last months of the war reunited with her parents at the Elders' home. Mayor Elders created that last false ID of Sophie Fossen that you saw earlier, and also renamed the Fröhlichs Fossens as well. This is the Elders' home that my grandfather dubbed the Elastic Home. During the war, 16 people lived there. The Elders, their 8 children, a maid, 3 Fröhlichs under the name of Fossen, 2 nieces sent from Amsterdam during the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, when there were extreme food shortages and starvation in the cities. My mother and her parents were living at the Elders' home when the Dutch were liberated on May 5th, 1945. My mother rode a bicycle to Amsterdam a few days later to join the celebration parade. She was given the honor of holding the flag of her Amsterdam school for the Victory Day celebration. You can see her at the front of her class headline. The pictures posted at the Amsterdam Resistance Museum are grim, of the 140,000 Jews who were there at the onset of World War I. 107 were transferred to camps, of which 95% perished. Those who went into hiding had a much higher survival rate. Unfortunately, Anne Frank and members of her family were among the 30% who were betrayed and did not survive. So my book shows the impact of anti-Semitism on one family. State-sponsored hate ignited the mass violence of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht upended the lives of hundreds of thousands of German families, like the Fröhlichs. Kristallnacht was the prelude to World War II and the Holocaust, the annihilation of 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children. It's hard to grasp or relate to such staggering numbers. People relate more to individual stories that personalize the horror. So, which is why Anne Frank's diary is such a powerful piece of work. And that is why I wrote the book, to preserve another individual's story. My hope is that it can be used to educate readers about the senseless cruelty of the anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust, but also to honor the brave people who rescued Jews from that catastrophe. And that's the end of the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I should X out of this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so we could kind of see everyone, Agnes. That would be just do it. Yeah, there we go. If anyone has any questions or comments, please ask away. What happened to Agnes, though? I think she X'd out of the whole meeting. Hold on. Yeah.
Let her back in.
Yeah, when she has her, yeah. Let's see. There she is. Yeah.
May I say something?
Sure. Yeah. Agnes is coming back in. So yeah, go ahead. Annette, was that you?
Yes, I'm Annette.
Yeah.
First, I wanted to thank Agnes for a marvelous presentation. She is a terrific presenter. She presented it in a compelling, very organized way, which is great. And I was curious about whether Sabine's parents ever came to the United States.
It's a very good question. Her mother did come to the United States when after my parents married and emigrated, because she did not want to return to Germany. My grandfather, however, was contacted by a nephew who had joined the British Army and was encouraged to apply to the Allied government to help rebuild the German legal system. So he returned to Germany and helped rebuild the German legal system. He was an ardent patriot and thought this was an aberration. He also, I think there was a bit of, as he told someone, those rogues took my son, I'm not letting them take my country. He became a judge and ultimately ended up on the Bundesverfassungsgericht, which is the German Supreme Court post-war. My grandmother reluctantly went back to Germany and joined him. And they reconnected with some old friends and had a pretty comfortable life afterwards. But yeah, my mother, on the other hand, said once her parents passed away, she would never set foot in Germany, and she didn't.
And have you set foot in Germany?
I have, because I visited my grandparents when I was young. I stayed with them.
But as an adult, did you?
They had I visited my grandmother. She was still alive after the birth of my daughter, so she could meet her first great-grandchild. So that was my last trip.
I asked that question because many survivors don't want to set foot in Germany. And interestingly, my father, who was a survivor, definitely wanted to go to Germany. His attitude was, I am here and I have a right to be where I want to be. And he said, I'm here in Berlin and the Nazis' bones are rotting below me and I've survived. So it's a very different kind of
It's similar to my father's attitude. You can't take away my country.
Mm-hmm.
You've done enough damage.
Yeah.
Others feel very differently.
I just want to say one a really irrelevant comment about the braids on your mother's photo.
Yeah.
Well, the cover of my book has my braids, and I hate it when my mother did my braids. So I really related to Sabine's attitude about the braid making.
Her hair was short for most of her life.
Agnes, this is Bob. My question is, I have two questions.
Mhm.
What caused your mother to decide to share with you what had happened? What precipitated that? And the second question is, this is such a unique situation. And I wonder if you've been approached by any filmmakers about making a narrative film based on Sabine's life and your whole family's life.
I would love to do that if you know of any filmmakers looking for the project. But to answer your first question, I was told the reason my mother went into hiding when I was younger was because my grandfather had spoken out against the Nazis. And there was truth to that explanation. I actually saw it written in a book. But she never told me about the real reason. And I found that out quite by accident when I was studying abroad my junior year in England. I looked up an elderly aunt who asked me if I knew about Andreas, and I told her I did, and I knew he had died in a concentration camp. And she said, well, they took him because he was Jewish. That was my very, very first. I was 20 years old, and that's how I first learned about it. I confronted my mother when I returned to the United States saying, why didn't you tell us this? And she said her mother made her promise never to tell because she didn't want the curse of that heritage to follow another generation. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, that's sort of similar to Madeleine Albright.
Yeah. Exactly. Unaware.
Yes,
I think she was even older when she first found out.
right.
But
And it's not.
you grow up an ocean apart from all your relatives, it's easier to keep secrets. So.
Right.
I'm astounded by the pictures that you have. Can you tell me how they survived all this moving?
I'm equally astounded by it. And the only explanation I can offer is that Christian friends saved those for them. I am usually blessed with a tremendous number, actually, of photographs.
Because they were probably hidden, or were they hidden, or?
They may have taken them to Holland and then put them for safekeeping with friends.
Okay.
So that's how they survived. And my mother, by the way, was a pack rat. So she saved everything, which is why, we have her original and the last of her false ID cards and other documentation. And she was a prolific correspondent. So I have letters from all the rescuers. I mean, it's one of the best documented survival stories because I can back up everything with a picture and documents and signed statements.
Agnes, have you been in touch, ongoing touch with some of the rescuers and their families?
Yes. Just this past May, we had Stolpersteins. Is everyone familiar with what that is? These are,
Yes.
There are little brass plaques put on pavement stones that give the name, and they're placed in front of the homes where Jews used to live. It was started by a German artist, and the philosophy was you shouldn't go to a memorial. You should know that these people lived among us, and these tragedies happened in our very neighborhood. So in last May, my brother organized to have 4 Stolpersteins placed in front of the apartment where my parents and my mother's brother and she last lived together in Amsterdam. And for that, my brother contacted a lot of the next generation of the survivors and some of the rescuers, and some 50 people showed up, families from the Uspers, the elders, and a number of other people. mostly from the next generation. One from my mother's generation was able to make it, or actually
Wow.
two. So, yeah, and if you go to Amsterdam, you will see those little brass stones, and they give the names where they first went into hiding and where they were when they were liberated. And then, of course, from my mother's brother that he perished in Mauthausen.
But were you able to put those Stolpersteine at the building in Poland? Because I understand the Polish government won't allow them.
No, I haven't tried to do that. That would be in Breslau, and I've heard similar stories that it's very difficult to get it in Poland, but we do have them memorialized in Amsterdam.
Good.
Can I ask a follow-up question about your mother?
Sure.
How long did she live in the United States? And during that period, what was she thinking about the US role after World War II with respect to any refugee groups?
It's a very good question. My mother lived to age 90. She passed away in July of 2017. She was enormously grateful and a very proud US citizen. I think getting citizenship was one of her happiest days. I think post-war we were a little more liberal about letting in refugees, but I never had a discussion with her about any bitterness for the fact that my grandmother had two brothers willing to vouch for her, but the US would not issue visas. If you've seen Ken Burns' most recent documentary, it's the story of my family. I mean, they had, and to get the paperwork in order, my grandfather probably had an advantage being a lawyer, but they could not get the US visas. Had they gotten it, the story would be different. I wouldn't be here. So, but yeah.
Thank you.
But it has very much sensitized me to, very few people leave their country on a lark, leave their family and everyone behind. It's usually pretty desperate circumstances that people to give up everything they've known and go to a foreign country with a different language, etc.
It's such an important point.
Yeah.
It's often missed in discussions of immigration.
Right. And
do you know if your mother was critical of the broader Catholic Church or anyone other than the Nazi leadership for not somehow interrupting this as it was scaling up? Did she express that ever? Or did she just not want to think about it anymore?
She did not express that, and I can't say I ever asked her about it. I know that the Catholics were instrumental in saving her. A number of priests were involved, or Catholic teachers. So, and she was a Catholic her whole life. She didn't necessarily agree with, she was, I would say, believed in the faith, but not necessarily in the papacy or some of the church hierarchy and those decisions. She was pretty liberal, but she remained a Catholic her whole life, as was my father.
Are you a practicing Catholic too?
I knew this question would come up sooner or later. I have to say I'm severely lapsed since probably age 20. And, but in an interesting twist of fate, my grandmother, who so much tried to distance herself, my first husband was Jewish, my children were raised Jewish, and my 5 grandchildren are all being raised Jewish. So the circle ties back together again. Other questions?
It's very inspirational to hear of your mother's survival and how she survived in Holland. It's especially touching to me because I found out only a few weeks ago through some DNA relatives that my family is actually related to Anne Frank, and thinking about, what will happen to her and the rest of her family. It's inspiring to hear her story.
Yeah, she was fortunate to get out of Amsterdam, very fortunate. And again, that's ironically through the connections made by her brother's friends who joined the resistance, who made the first connections with the North Holland countryside, which turned out to be safer, but not totally as,
Safe. Yeah.
yeah, as my father's uncle, was caught by the Dutch Nazis for his activities. So, but it was much safer than being hidden in a city.
Do you have connections to I gotta think for a second, is it your great uncles, the ones, two families that came first?
Yeah, it's actually, I did. They've both passed away since, but my mother actually, when she first emigrated here, stayed with the Rudolf Nissen. He's someone you can Google, by the way. He's a pretty famous surgeon. He invented something called the Nissen fundoplication.
I think I've heard of it. Yeah.
You've heard of that, and also operated on Albert Einstein and a lot of famous people, and has written a autobiography in German. So I did spend time with him. I was too young to remember living there, but I did visit him. He ultimately went to Switzerland, and I visited him there. Ferdi, I have no memories of because he died very young of a heart attack, age 50. So I would have been a child when that happened. He was able to find retail jobs, but yeah, so I do remember them. I do remember particularly my uncle Rudolf Nissen. He was another one who would not go back. He was recruited back to Germany and he refused to go. He just trusted there wouldn't be former Nazis working in the same hospital. So people had very different reactions to.
Yeah.
Does anyone have more questions or comments that they'd like to ask Agnes?
I have another question. Agnes,
I love questions.
have you yourself or any of the other boosters of your book used it with education for American, like high school students or other young people?
Yeah, I would love to do that. I'm not quite sure how to go about doing it, but I think it's a teenager who went into hiding. I think it would for those schools that use Holocaust education. That was one of my hopes, that it could be used for Holocaust education, but I can't say I've been successful in that.
So if you know how to type your contact info into the chat,
Okay.
I have a connection to a network of
Okay.
American Jews. Some of them are in Texas, some of them are in Buffalo, and they run together with a brilliant creative teacher in Western New York called Leanne Hendricks. Anyway, I'll send you all this info. They started 5 years ago, one of the most creative grassroots projects for doing anti-hate, Holocaust, anti-racism education. That's used in a lot of rural schools, and they take their leading students once a year to Washington, D.C., to the Holocaust Museum. Anyway, I'd love to put you in touch with them.
I'd be honored to do that if I can figure out how to get my.
If not, if you know how to read the chat, I'll type my contact info, and tomorrow you can reach
Yeah, I'm
out.
not pulling up the chat. I'm happy to give you my email right now.
Okay, let me get a piece of paper.
I can type it in the chat as you say it. Agnes, go ahead.
Okay, because I can't pull up the chat for some reason.
I'll do it. That's okay.
It's Schipper, SCHIP, like my last name, SCHIP, A, Agnes, M, Maria, E, Elizabeth, AME, @gmail.com. And I also have a Sabine's Odyssey @gmail.com. So either of those would work.
Is that correct? Make sure that's correct. Agnes, can you see that? SCHIPAME @gmail.com.
Correct.
Can everybody see that?
I'm happy to take follow-up questions if when you hang up, you think of something else. Well, thank you, Diane, very much for organizing this and publicizing it. And thank you all for attending and for your good questions. I just love questions.
Yeah.
Shows people actually listened, are still awake. So I'm very honored.
we thank you, and
Yeah.
we're very honored to hear your story. So thank you so much, and please get the book from the library, read Sabine's Odyssey, and stay in touch. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you. Be well. Take
Thank
care, Agnes, and thank you again.
Alrighty.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Where does she live?